Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. Blessed are you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth. You have revealed to little ones the mysteries of the kingdom. Alleluia, Alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. The mother of Jesus and his brothers arrived at the house. Standing outside, they sent word to Jesus and called him. The crowd seated around him told him, "Your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside asking for you." He said to them in reply, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking around at those seated in the circle, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." The Gospel of the Lord. Today is the feast day of St. Francis de Sales. St. Francis de Sales is one of the doctors of the Church. St. Francis de Sales lived during the time of the Protestant Reformation. He was a contemporary with John Calvin, and he was also from Switzerland, as Calvin was. Francis de Sales is known for many different things. He's got a famous book called The Introduction to the Devout Life, which is basically a spiritual guide for a layperson on how to pursue holiness in their lives. So many of the great classic spiritual works of Christianity, if they were tailored towards the spiritual life, they were largely oriented towards a priest or a monk or a religious sister, someone who has a monastic way of life. And so St. Francis de Sales is one of the famous books that was written particularly for a layperson, how to pursue holiness within the world. And so it's a great book that you can find and read someday. St. Francis de Sales was also a great bishop during the time of the Protestant Reformation. He was also an exorcist, which is one of the little-known facts about him, is that he performed many exorcisms in his life. One of the things that I think is particularly inspiring about St. Francis de Sales was his passion to convert Protestant Christians. So like I said, he was living during the time of the Protestant Reformation, and Switzerland was one of the Protestant strongholds because it was in Geneva where John Calvin basically set up his Calvinist city. Right? And there were many laws in the city about priests not even being allowed to come in. Right? You could be punished. They took heresy very seriously in those days. And St. Francis de Sales was a very intelligent man. He had gone to law school as a young man, and instead of becoming a lawyer, he decided to become a priest and use his intellect to serve God in that way. And so he was a brilliant orator and a brilliant debater. And what's kind of interesting about his interactions with some of the Protestants is that he didn't have a whole lot of success in the beginning in converting anyone. Basically, he would go into different towns in Switzerland, and he would secretly meet with some of the Catholics in the town. And on occasion, he would be able to preach in a church. And oftentimes, this was very difficult because literally there were laws against this. So he would have to basically be in hiding at night. Many stories talk about how it was so cold outside where he was sleeping that his body actually began to bleed. There's also stories about him sleeping in trees because, again, he was out in nature. And so wanting to be safe from wild creatures, he had to sleep in the trees. Now, some of those, obviously, those are personal stories, so maybe some of those are exaggerated, but the point is still real. He sacrificed a lot to try to convert the Protestants in his day. And what's kind of interesting is that even though he did not have a whole lot of success in the beginning, he suddenly had an idea. Many of you are familiar with Christian pamphlets that you'll see on occasion. Sometimes it's very common in like Baptist churches and stuff like that. Sometimes they're about being saved, or sometimes they're about the Catholic Church or any other such thing. And you find these little pamphlets that people will hand out or they'll leave out in places. It turns out that the inventor of that strategy was actually St. Francis de Sales. He made Catholic pamphlets because he had such a hard time being able to let his voice be heard in public. So instead, he began to print these pamphlets about the Catholic faith, and he would leave them on people's doorstops and things, even in the middle of the night. Right? One of his ways of forcing these doctrines in. And people began to convert in large numbers. It is said that St. Francis de Sales in his day converted over 60,000 Calvinists to the Catholic faith. Right? Now, personally, I think that we could learn from this. Maybe we should be imitating those Protestants who are making pamphlets. But even more to the point, what St. Francis de Sales realized is basically that Catholicism had been silenced in his day. It wasn't so much that people had knowingly rejected Catholicism, as much as they had never actually heard the case for Catholicism. Everything they had heard had been distorted by the bias of the Calvinist theology. Kind of reminds me of our own day. Archbishop Fulton Sheen was once famously said that there are not even 10 people in the world who hate the Catholic Church, but there are hundreds and thousands who think they know what the Catholic Church is, and they hate that church. In our age, I think one of the most exciting things is that people seriously and truly are, in many cases, just ignorant of what Catholicism actually is. And if they were not ignorant, they would see how beautiful it is and how intellectually defensible it is. And so I think we could learn a lot from St. Francis de Sales. I think we should call him the patron saint of Catholic propaganda. And I think we as Catholics would do well to create more Catholic propaganda. Not anything that distorts the truth, right? Not that version of propaganda, but true propaganda. Something that shows forth the beauty and truth of our faith. And we need to do a much better job of getting that out in the public sphere, because there are so many people who simply have never heard. They've never been taught. They've never been told. They have no idea how beautiful and substantial our faith is. So I pray that we might be inspired by the example of St. Francis de Sales to come up with creative ways as well to spread the faith, especially among those who are ignorant.